All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for taking time to join us today to hear from the Green Fee Advisory Council. Excuse me. So excited to share our latest updates with everyone. And we have had over 400 registrants for this webinar. So we're really thankful for the continued interest in the progress and the updates from this advisory council. And we're looking forward to sharing in pretty great detail where the council has been and where we're headed with this effort. This is the second webinar hosted by the Green Fee Advisory Council, and we, as a preview, will be inviting everyone to a third webinar coming up soon to continue to offer regular updates and provide an opportunity for conversation between, interested members of the public, our decision makers and policymakers, and our community of folks who are deeply invested in the outcomes of this process and what the Green Fee funds can do for our community, just like these advisory council members are. My name is Christine Matsuda, and I'll be your moderator today. Who you see on the screen here are four members of the Green Fee Advisory Council: our chair, Jeff Nicolina, Carmela Razuma, Jack Kittinger, and Dennis Wang, who will be introducing themselves more fully in just a moment. We'll just talk through quickly what our agenda is for today's webinar. We have what seems like a lot of time, but a lot of information to share with you. So we will be doing our best to kind of share as much as we can and really look forward to your questions at the end. First, we're going to provide some important reminders and grounding about the structure of the Green Fee, which was established by Act 96, and information about the Green Fee Advisory Council. We'll talk about the council's evaluation criteria, which was the next step that we discussed when we had our first webinar with you all to share that sort of outlook and trajectory for this process. So that evaluation criteria has been established, and we're gonna preview all of that with you folks. We'll talk about an overview of the project ideas and proposals that were submitted by state and department agencies, as well as the many proposals that came in through the public, through our Public Ideas portal. And thank you so much for all of you who are on the webinar today, who did submit those proposals through the Public Ideas webinar, and just really, really appreciate that participation. Finally, we'll talk about some insight into the council's next steps and the timeline. And it's very important to us that we answer as many questions as we can from the participants. There are a lot of you guys. And so if we do not get to all of the questions that are entered into the Q&A function during the course of this webinar, we will absolutely follow up with you, just like we did with the first webinar. If there are questions that don't get answered live or in writing, if it's something that is a recurring question, we'll add that question to the FAQ on the website, which is greenfeehawaii.org. Or if it's something that's very specific to an individual or an organizational question, then we can follow up with you folks via email using the email that you use to register for this webinar. So thank you for providing that good contact information for us. We're going to be using the Q&A function in Zoom. So there is like the chat and the Q&A, right? So we're going to be looking at the Q&A box for the questions that are coming in. Given how much curiosity there is, we really encourage folks to go ahead and put your questions in as they occur to you, instead of waiting all the way until the very end, because that way, as a moderator, I'll be able to keep an eye on those questions and hopefully group some together thematically to ask of our Green Fee Advisory Council members. And then if we can, we'll answer in real time in writing for any questions that we're able to address, just kind of on a rolling basis as we go. So Jeff, over to you, chair of our Green Fee Advisory Council, to introduce the council and the members of the advisory council that are participating today in the webinar.
Right. Mahalo, Christine. And so appreciate everyone joining us today for this. The Green Fee is truly an unprecedented generational opportunity to develop resources for Hawaii's natural resources, climate resilience, and really our future. So we really appreciate all of you helping shape that process for us. If you joined our first webinar, you're already familiar with the council's purpose and members and all of that background, but here's a quick reminder. We are a group of 10 unpaid volunteer members We're really building on that work of the climate advisory team that was chaired by Chris Benjamin, that governor put together last year. And our goal here is to identify and prioritize projects to ensure those green fee funds that come in are invested in ways really with the greatest impact and benefit of our communities, regenerative tourism, climate resilience, both today and in the future. And there's some balance there. Governor asked if I would chair the Green Fee Council, and I am all in on this, but fortunately joined by just an all-star cast of 9 other council members. 3 of them are with us here today, and I would like them to introduce themselves, maybe starting with you, Carmela.
Aloha, I'm Carmela Rasuma from Kilohana and the Hawaiian Council.
Dennis?
Hello, everyone. I'm Dennis Huang with the University of Hawaii Sea Grant, and it's glad to be on the council.
Jack?
Aloha, my name is Jack Kittinger. I'm with Conservation International and Arizona State University. Back to you, Jeff.
Right on. And you'll be hearing from them shortly. But just to introduce some of the other members here, we have Keone Kuoha, who is just got back from Hokulea. He was sailing all over the South Pacific, and he probably had the best Zoom background I've ever seen in a Zoom meeting. He still joined us via Starlink for some of these. The others include Hawaii Community Foundation's Michelle Kauhane. Eric Koh is Executive Director of Castle Foundation. We have representation from the visitor industry, Jeff Wagner, who's CEO, President of Outrigger Hospitality Group, folks working in land conservation and preservation like Leah Hong, and then Janice Ikeda from Hawaii Island, who runs Vibrant Hawaii, helping to develop resilience hubs throughout the state. So by my estimate, I think we have 2 centuries of experience in the various sectors across, not to age us too much, but across these 10 members. So a lot of just great background, perspective, skill set to bring to this process. So again, if you were at our first webinar, you understand the background behind the Green Fee, but really simply, this was established by legislation last year, signed into law as Act 96. The purpose was to use a small increase in the transient accommodations tax and put that towards protecting the place that folks are coming to visit, and also build our climate resilience and our sort of our sustainable tourism, regenerative tourism, to make sure that we can not only reduce the burden that tourists have in Hawaii, but also hopefully, leverage some of that so they can leave Hawaii in a better place. A lot of this was born after the tragedy on Lahaina, and thinking about how vulnerable Hawaii is and the huge gap that we have for resources to better protect Hawaii. So it's a 0.75% increase. It takes effect January 1st, 2026. It's everyone who's staying in hotels, vacation rentals, and cruise ships. We estimate it'll raise about $100 million annually. Our first tranche of funding, since the fiscal year starts in July, is going to be a bit more of that, because we start collecting in January, and then the funding of the projects will start in July. So I think top of mind for many of you is this cruise industry question, if you've been paying attention to the news at all. This is something where it's a bit of a challenge. The cruise line industry has filed suit against the state over the green fee. The latest information we have is the Department of Attorney General is actively addressing the case, and this is playing out through the court system. So they're vigorously defending the green fee in court. According to recent news, the U.S. Department of Justice filed a motion to intervene in the case, and it's currently working through that process. Just to note, though, on Act 96, this doesn't, jeopardize the entire green fee. The way the legislation was written, the cruise ship part of that law is severable from the rest of the act. So in the unfortunate case that the lawsuit prevails, then the remainder of the green fee will stay in place. It'll just be reduced slightly if we lose that chunk of the cruise ship funding. But again, big picture, expected to generate a significant chunk, about $100 million annually. And then the purpose of these funds is going to be directed to three buckets, and this is very explicit in the legislation. The funding priorities, and again, the annual appropriation or the annual revenue brought in through this green fee is to be distributed in equal portions to these buckets. Environmental stewardship, things that we traditionally think of for natural resource protection, watershed protection, species, coral reefs, and the like. The second category is hazard mitigation, infrastructure resilience, helping Hawaii become stronger than storms and be in a better position with changing climate. So everything to do with coastal protection, sea level rise, wildfire mitigation, hurricane protection, things like infrastructure resilience, maybe hurricane clips for homeowners to keep the roof off when a hurricane comes, keep the roof on. And then the third bucket, sustainable tourism. So again, this is really the interface between visitors and our natural resources and their experience, ways to ensure that they have a reduced burden in Hawaii, a more positive visitor experience. And when they come to Hawaii to have this life-changing experience, they leave Hawaii in a better place than they found it, ideally. So these are our three buckets that we're looking at. Really, these are interconnected, and we're finding that as we go through proposed projects. There are so many that transcend these buckets, and the magic really happens when we can sort of solve for one challenge and have carry on benefits to other sort of co-benefits. And you can think of something like removing non-native flammable grasses and planting native forest that provides habitat, reduces runoff to the reef, provides climate resilience for wildfire reduction, perhaps a more positive visitor experience. So that's really the sweet spot, kind of transcending all these buckets. But we're taking the charge in the legislation seriously and looking at equal portions to these three categories. Okay, so lastly, looking at what our charge is and what's that deliverable that we hope to produce. First one is complete, and this is really, this is a novel process this year. We've been at it for just over 2 months, and it was really kind of deciding how to decide. So how are we going to structure this process and developing that criteria for evaluating project proposals? And we'll hear from Carmela all about that we landed on. And then obviously coming up with that first portfolio of projects. So, selecting those projects, developing the budgets for the three buckets, and sharing that then with the governor per the legislation. So how that works then is when the governor receives our advice, again, we're simply advisory, he will then turn around and submit this to the legislature in his supplemental budget request going into the next legislative session. Ultimately, it's up to the legislature to decide how these dollars will be spent. So that's going to be a process that happens in the spring, and I'm sure many of you will want to engage in that process. I'm sure the other question on many of your minds is, where's the list? And this is just an active process. The council has been working incredibly hard. I'm just so impressed with the amount of time and energy and enthusiasm that folks have dedicated as volunteers in helping to develop the process, the evaluation criteria, thinking how we ensure we can keep this transparent, objective, and fair as possible. We had an all-day retreat yesterday. It was our second all-day retreat. And we're currently working through it. So we'll be sharing our recommendations with the governor as soon as possible, and then sharing them out with you and the public before the start of the 2026 legislative session in January. So that's the timeline. That's what we're looking at. We'll get more into that a little bit later. But for now, I'd like to throw it to Carmela to share a bit about the evaluation criteria.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeff, for building all that foundation for us. So also, first of all, hi, happy to see everyone in this virtual room. As Jeff mentioned, we are committed to providing a thorough, equitable, and transparent evaluation of projects for potential green fee funding. Many of us have applied for many, whatever you call it, grant, RFP funding. So we understand what it's like to be on the other side of this. And so we are treating this with the highest level of scrutiny that we can. And also thank you to the many departments, individuals, organizations, community members who provided input on the evaluation criteria and submitted project ideas for the Green Fee Advisory Council to consider and evaluate. And so with this approach, we've developed a criteria and a process for evaluating the projects to ensure that the recommendations of our council really centers the need of our community and our INA. And so with that, I'm going to go into the 5 main criteria areas by which we're evaluating the projects against. And so, we love a good kind of like repetitious, like good thing to remember. So we have the 5 R's. We have results, readiness, relevance, relationships, and region. And so you might be asking, there are words, like what do they all mean? So we're going to kind of go into each of them a little bit to give you a peek into what the criteria means more. And just very quick sidebar, this was informed by so many rubrics and criteria that many, grant-making organizations, both within the council and external, have shared what criteria are. So best reflection of where we are as kind of like a community in terms of how we evaluate. So first is the results criteria. And so based on the directive of the legislature, we wanted to recommend green fee projects that have an immediate and tangible outcome that reduces harm, builds resilience, and really contributes to the protection and restoration of ecosystems across Hawaii. And so this is kind of at the forefront, like what is this going to do, for this? What are the results going to be? And the second evaluation criterion is readiness. So how soon can this project be implemented? And so in this category, we consider whether a project can be completed in the proposed timeframe, if you have access to things like permits and compliance requirements. We're also looking for information about existing infrastructure and systems that allow the project to be successfully implemented, ensuring that the funding goes towards shovel-ready projects, like good to go, already going, and we are simply like making the work happen. Next, we evaluate the relevance. And so is this project like grounded in traditional Indigenous knowledge, strong data? Are there management plans behind it? Is it relevant to the funding priorities, those 3 buckets outlined in Act 96? Will it have a proven positive impact on our state's natural resources, climate and disaster resilience, or sustainable destination management for our visitor industry? And fourth, we'll evaluate the proposed project's relationships. So does this center community? Can this project leverage additional resources? Does it promote collaboration, cooperation among government, nonprofit groups, community partners, other stakeholders to really have like a collective effort to make this work happen? And we really want to also assess, or we are assessing, like whether a project is community-led, has a strong connection to our state's most at-risk communities. And finally, we're evaluating the project for its regional impact. So prioritizing projects that address issues in geographic areas with demonstrated need, where there's at most risk to disaster, the impacts of over-tourism, or which may typically receive areas that might receive insufficient funding historically. And so we have all of our 5 R's. And so what's the process now for scoring the projects? And so we developed the rubric and the scoring system. And so we are operating on kind of like a 4-point system. So 4 is excellent, exceeds expectations. Good is, gives each criteria 3, meets expectations, like kind of mostly aligns with criteria, with some exceptions. 2 is developing, so partially meets expectations, lacks alignment with our criteria. And 1 is limited, so does not meet expectations, no alignment with criteria. And so we are actively scoring the projects, which will get us the initial list of funding recommendations. And so in terms of how we're scoring, so each, and I think we'll get into the data points later on, but we received hundreds and hundreds. And again, mahalo to the community for submitting all the different projects. So each council member is responsible for reviewing a selection of projects that align with their specific area of expertise. And so each project is reviewed by at least 3 council members, and we randomly assign those to make sure that there is data integrity in the process. And the rubric itself was informed by multiple stakeholders as well. And so right now we're in this like moment of, again, actively scoring the projects, and then making sure there's a fair distribution between the three funding priorities, which again, to reiterate, are environmental stewardship, climate resilience and hazard mitigation, and sustainable tourism. And if the kind of like total cost of all these projects is achievable with kind of the estimated funding available for year one. And then we have two other considerations that are not scored, but are considered in this kind of like overall kind of bird's eye outlook of how the entire list of priorities looks like. So transparency. So will the general public understand the impact of how these funds were spent? And also costs. So with the information presented, and sometimes I know for folks who submitted through the portal, there's not a ton of information that we wanted that was collected. And so with the information presented, does this project have a return on investment? And so we would hope to evaluate kind of like that notion of return on investment in the future. And so, these criteria will use like qualitatively to inform the council's final recommendations. And so there's a lot of thinking that went on in the past, 6 weeks to get this together, but really mahalo to kind of all the brains in the council for really just amassing all the expertise and best practices. And so I'm now excited to pass it over to Jack, who will give us like a very high level overview of the projects that we're evaluating and where things stand with that.
Thank you, Carmela, and thanks again to everyone who's joined this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here and to share some of our progress with all of you. As Carmela indicated, we had a tremendous amount of projects to evaluate, over 600, about 620 or thereabouts, quite a lot of incredible projects from across the islands. And where do we get those projects? So let's go straight to the two sources of that. The first is from the state agencies. The departmental proposals were submitted through the budget and finance process that the state has used for a long time, and the Advisory Council took receipt of the departmental proposals for that. We'll look at that in more detail in a moment. The second way that we solicited ideas was directly from all of you and your friends, neighbors, and colleagues across the Pai'aina. We opened a public portal from October 15th to November 1st. This is something that the Advisory Council felt very strongly about, making sure that the public and community groups and folks on the front lines of our challenges in climate, in environment, in the visitor industry had the ability to put good project ideas into the pipeline for us to consider. And indeed we did. We got over 480 submissions from the public, so we'll talk about that in a moment too, but a wide range of projects. In total, over 620 projects, which we have had to evaluate and are still in the process of evaluating on the rubric that Carmela just shared with all of us. So quite a task, but also quite an amazing thing to be involved in. So together, those projects total up to $2 billion. Now, we don't quite have that amount of money. I wish we did, but it also demonstrates very clearly the need, the interest, and the enthusiasm across our community from our agencies and our frontline organizations all across the state in proposing projects under this funding. So that's where we're at right now in terms of the pipeline and the evaluation. Let's look at what has come in from the different sources of projects. Let's start with the departments. Over 100 proposals submitted by state departments, the majority, unsurprisingly, from the Department of Land and Natural Resources, which is one of the many agencies that has primary kuleana for our natural resources and our stewardship efforts, but also proposals from other agencies. And you can see the list here on this slide. It's quite a cross-section of responsibilities that different agencies have, from DBED to the Department of Ag, Transportation, and more. So lots of agencies proposing projects for the funding. If you look at the breakdown of what is the mix of projects, most of them, as I think Jeff mentioned early, transcend multiple categories. We're looking at them like, is this first and foremost an environmental project? Is it first and foremost a visitor project? Or is it firstly a climate and hazard mitigation project? but many of them touch multiple categories. So the pie graph you see is sort of what those projects lead with, but lots of them have elements or co-benefits or dimensions of the initiative that touch on multiple categories. That 9.52 or more categories slice is indicative of that, but a great set of initiatives across the board that our state agencies have locked into for the funding. Now, if you look at the price tag for these projects, it varies considerably, but only less than 10% of those projects are big projects, over 5 million. A lot of them are solid projects that are in much more feasible price tags. We've got about a quarter of the projects that are less than a half a million. Lots of another quarter that's 100K to 250K. With 100 million estimated for year one in funding, we should be able to do a lot of good, for the agency projects that rank highly on the evaluation and scoring, but have a relatively good cost to benefit ratio for what they're focusing on. And that's very encouraging because, with $2 billion in projects, we have to be judicious about how we score, evaluate, and ultimately kind of suggest these projects to the governor and legislature for funding. All right, let's move on to the Public Ideas Portal. As I mentioned, an incredible overview of these of projects and submissions from across the board, really from like communities across the Pai'aina. It was unbelievable. So thank you to all of you. I know probably many of you are on the call that submitted these projects. Thank you for taking the time to do so. We had the portal open for 2 weeks and got quite a richness of information and really incredible ideas across the board from all of you and your friends, neighbors, and colleagues that work on these issues in our community. So let's take a look at what the mix of this is. We had several of these things that were primarily kind of nonprofit or community-based organizations, almost half. There were some projects that are directly from community members or neighborhoods or individuals, about 20, roughly a quarter of the projects. And then we did have some submissions directly from city and county departments, as well as other state agencies that put through the portal. Let's take a look at the mix of where they touched on in terms of like the categories. The majority of them were focused on environmental stewardship and natural resource management. So we've got quite a rich set of projects there. But clearly other interests in the issues of visitor experience and sustainable tourism, as well as climate and hazard mitigation. So great to see interest from across the board in the 3 categories. And similar to the departmental submissions, there were a lot of projects that are, let's say, smaller projects between 100,000 to 250K or a half a million. There were some big projects in the mix too, things that were over 10 million or at a price tag between 1 and 5 million. So we have a good mix there of different projects. And of course, part of this is trying to figure out how we will evaluate projects that clearly are multi-year projects, but for us, the Act only allows us to propose projects that can be funded in year 1. So that's something that we're taking into consideration, that maybe some of these projects might have a high price tag, but that might represent work that will be ongoing, or it represents a project that already is ongoing and is applying for green fee funding now. So all in all, very positive. And I can just say personally that seeing in some ways, this is an incredible snapshot of the work that our community members are already doing in so many places. And it really is heartening to me, and I know many of the council members, to see all the work that you are doing. And hopefully the green fee funding will allow us to magnify, invest, support, stand up, and make durable those efforts over the long term. Okay. I think this is my last slide, but there's sort of, in presenting the departmental projects and the community projects, that can sort of seem like, well, we have to choose between departmental versus community priorities. It's actually not the case. All the departmental proposals, the vast majority of them said we're working with community in these places, and community and submitters of the public portal said we're in partnership with these different state and county agencies, et cetera. So over 90% of the projects that are in there are really not a departmental or a community project, they're both. And that's exactly, I think, what is just one voice in the council that we'd like to see is deep partnership. This is how we do all of these efforts, whether it's climate and hazard mitigation, environmental stewardship, or improving the visitor experience. We are doing this hand in hand with government and community working together. So with that, I think I will pass it back to you, Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. And thanks, Carmela. You can see why we're so fortunate to have these just super sharp minds and voices. I also want to give a shout out to Pa'akai Communications that has just been excellent in helping to share all this material and communicate it clearly while we're, I won't say frantically, but rapidly moving through this new process and kind of making it up as we go. But I think we're in a really good place. Now that we have the evaluation system in place, we have the project proposals, and as Jack shared, a diversity of proposals from across the state, across groups. We're doing the difficult task of evaluating, prioritizing, seeing how these things fit together, making sure that we're hitting those themes that are so critical that the climate advisory team identified to, increase our climate resilience, protect natural resources, and develop a more sustainable tourism economy. So I shared a bit about the timeline before, but just to recap, in December, we'll be sharing our proposals with Governor Green. From there, we hope most of those recommendations make it into his supplemental executive budget that will be sent to the legislature. And Jack sort of alluded to this. I should have mentioned it before, but this funding does have to flow through departments, and that's just a function of how the legislation was written. It's unfortunately not a special fund. It's flowing through departments, and so that's what we're working with. Not to say that those departments can't then possibly do procurement, contracting, granting, using other existing mechanisms to get that into community or in partnership. Like there's so many partnerships that already exist, but that's how this process is going to work. And then ultimately, it's the legislature that will be deciding. So when this kicks in, January 1st, start collecting the funds. The legislature, throughout the legislative process in spring, will be deciding ultimately which projects will be funded through this. And then the fiscal year starts July 1st, 2026, and we will see projects start to be executed. And as Jack shared, our charge is really identifying those projects that can be, funded in year one, or the funds are encumbered. So it could be a multi-year process, but they have to be encumbered in that year one. Otherwise, they flow back to the general fund, and we want to make sure every dollar goes to the intent of the green fee. So looking ahead, we are going to do another webinar. We think it's really critical to stay in touch with you to keep this transparent. As soon as we have that list of recommendations shared with the governor, and then in January, we want to share that out with the public. So we haven't set the date for this yet, but you have that QR code. You can stay in touch with our email, and we will make sure you're aware of that upcoming webinar in January. And at that, we will, kind of recap what we've done, share that final portfolio of projects in the 3 buckets, and then, talk about the legislative process that we'll be entering into. We need your help on this. We're doing the best we can as the council, working with Pa'akai, working with administration, but ultimately it's going to be up to the legislature. We want to equip them with the most objective, best thinking behind what we think we should fund in year one. But again, it's going to be the legislature making those decisions. So if we do our jobs well, we will have a rock solid year one portfolio of projects. And then it's going to be up to the legislature. So we know that many of you are very much passionate about this, and we deeply appreciate that. We need your support, your mana'o, to kind of drive this forward and get this over the finish line. So we encourage you to testify on those budget bills when they come up during the legislative session. We will stay in touch about that. And reaching out to legislators directly and sharing not only how important this green fee is, but the mix of projects that are identified, how critical those are for community, for advancing the intention of the green fee. So with that, I think we're ahead of schedule, which is great because we really want to dedicate as much time as possible to your input, your questions, see what's on your mind. And so we will switch over to that process now. And just a reminder, if we don't get to all these questions, we will also be updating the FAQ on the greenfeehawaii.org website. So you can stay tuned to that as well.
And indeed, we have lots of questions. So thank you, everybody who have been submitting questions as we go. Our team has been answering questions and writing live. So if you haven't been checking on that Q&A box in your Zoom screen, please take a look at that. And there are about 20 that have already been addressed in writing. And if time allows, and some of those that are recurring themes of questions, we can bring those back to answer verbally with the advisory council here in case we have folks who are, on audio only and, aren't in a position to be able to read through all of those Q&A that are answered in writing. I'll tackle one right off the bat that we got a number of questions about, and this is something we're really curious about too. How much revenue do the cruise ships represent as a part of the green fee funds? We would really like to understand that as well. So we're checking with DOTAX, and that's certainly something that is of great interest to the Green Fee Advisory Council too. So I'm just going to kind of work through the questions that we received. There's some really good ones, really meaty ones. And so if we don't quite answer your question or we misinterpret it, please let me know. Ask a follow-up question. We really encourage that right there in that Q&A section. So let's see. So here's a good question for Jeff. This is very related to where you just closed us out. The questioner asks, given that the green fee goes to the state's general fund before distribution to projects via the budget, what are the mechanisms in place to ensure that it is actually spent in Act 96 3 funding priorities? Are we just relying on the legislature to generally approve the suggestions from the governor, who we're trusting to follow the recommendations from the advisory council? Or are there other means of ensuring that these funds are spent on the desired causes? I love this question because this relates directly to what you were saying to us, Jeff, about this being an effort that requires all of us for that kind of accountability and keeping the recommendations moving through the legislative process.
100%. Yeah. And you put your finger on something, and it's a constraint that we're dealing with. But all the funding does flow through departments. It is up to the legislature to make those decisions. We have every expectation that they are going to stay true to the intent of the green fee. In a perfect world, they're going to, both governor and the legislature will see our final recommendations and see value in that. But it's going to the legislature, which is a very democratic, deliberative process with a diversity of interests. So we're going to need your voices to make sure that we have broad support for this. There's a shared understanding of the value of the projects, of the need. And yeah, passing this was a Herculean task, and a lot of groups were involved in making this happen over many years. And here we are. This is, in part why we really want to, privilege projects in year one that are high impact and visible and have some kind of flagship projects so people can truly see the value of this green fee in year one and understand how important these resources are. Again, this is the first in the nation. Hawaii was the first to have this sort of visitor impact fee. And we think we could have really some impact beyond our shores if we do this well. But again, that's going to be up to the legislature to make those final determinations. And with all of us working together, we can make it happen.
So we're going to stay on this legislative process theme for a second with another question. If our project gets recommended and gets passed through the legislative process, how will the funding be administered, and would we still need to apply through an RFP? So I'm reading between the lines a little bit with this question. It sounds like this might be from a community organization or a nonprofit, not a state agency, kind of wondering about how that part of the process would work.
Carmela, do you want to jump in on that?
Happy to. Okay, so actually, Christine, can you just repeat the question? I was thinking about four different things, and I want to make sure I'm as abundantly clear as possible.
Yeah, absolutely, Carmela. So it's a process question. So I'm making an assumption, and question asker, please correct me if this is an incorrect assumption, that this is like a community group or a nonprofit asking about what happens if their project scores really high and makes it into the recommendations that go to the governor and ultimately gets included as a priority that passes through the legislative process. The question is like, okay, then what? Do we now need to apply for an RFP through an RFP process through a state agency, or sort of how would that work?
So there's the simplest answer, and I'm just going to be honest. The honest answer is still a little bit unclear, because I think a lot of the priority projects that we're looking at, there's so many good ones. We are not spoiled for choice in terms of like how good a lot of the community work is, especially in terms of like the folks of it from a place wanting to steward a place and hope and asking for funding for that. So I'd say one of two things, actually two of two things. I drank a lot of coffee this morning. Apologies. First thing is that if you folks have a pre-existing relationship with a state agency, that's how, pre-existing relationship meaning like already our existing RFP or contract, or, something like I forget the word, but a pre-existing relationship, that's probably the vehicle by which that would happen. Alternatively, I think one of the recommendations we're making as a council, and I don't think it's preemptive to say this, is kind of figuring out what the mechanism is by which agency and community can connect for the funding. And so that is kind of a big to be determined, but something that we're hoping to recommend as a council to make the funding as accessible to community as possible. And I think the last thing I'll say, just from a clarity perspective, as a council, we are recommending priorities for the funding, and it's going to be hard for us, or we have been strategic in that we are not going to say, organization XYZ getting funding in this amount. But we will say this issue is particularly important. We think this should be prioritized in this area, and we recommend doing this work in this manner. And so I think, we are hoping that in and of itself will lend itself to the next step in terms of, okay, who's going to do that work? And as a community, we're very well aware of in certain areas, there's definitely community leaders and stakeholders that are best positioned to do that. And so we are advocating, I'll say for myself, I'm advocating that, money gets into community as much as possible. We're trying to figure out how. That was a lot of words, but I hopefully that answered that question.
Yeah, thanks, Carmela. Oh, somebody wanted to jump in and add.
Yeah, Christine, I imagine that each department will have their own process, but many of them already work with many of these other organizations. So what process, it would probably be up to that state department to determine how it gets funneled to the appropriate group. They would have to follow their own procedures and processes and rules, but we would give them guidance on what type of project was being recommended. Again, we can't recommend a specific name for an entity. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
thank you for this.
I'm sorry, Christine. I think that just jumps into kind of procurement law. Like, we can't just say,
Yeah.
we love this nonprofit, give them a bunch of money, state agency. So
Yeah.
that's what we're trying to kind of get around and dance around. So
Yeah, thanks very much. There are a handful of questions here that I'm going to try and group together, if I may, about the 1 year funding cycle. We have some comments from folks as well as some questions about, how unsustainable it is to plan on 1 year funding cycles if you are especially doing INA-based work that takes a long time to come to fruition. So if I can invite our council members to address generally some of these themes that are coming up in the questions about this one-year funding cycle issue, it's like, is there a idea toward multi-year funding and how that might be examined? Is that sort of thing being considered? And I'll add my follow-up question there is like what's allowable with respect to the actual statute, which is important. And then some other themes that are coming up in this bucket of the funding cycle issue. It's just how are we considering the scoring for when we talk about ROI and when we'll see results of things that are worthwhile investments, but will take some time to bear fruit. So Jack, do you want to kick us off on that, and then we can invite other Greenfee members to add?
Sure. This is a really a question that's front of our minds because we did not get here through a short timeline to the current challenges we have, and we are not going to get out of the current situation in 1 year. The nature of these challenges is that they are generational. They were created over several generations, and we're trying to address them in as short possible as time. That said, the legislation is written in such a way, like several other parameters that Jeff and Carmela and Dennis have pointed out, that I don't want to say, our hands are tied, but we have to be within the constraints of how the statute, as it's written, allows us to program funding. And the tax is collected this starting January 1st. The legislature, who is our, the body in our government who makes decisions about our budget, will receive a supplemental budget with their prioritized requests from the governor, and they will deliberate about that, and they will pass this as part of the budget bill, which typically passes in May, and starting July 1st, the funding can flow. Now, Carmela just took everyone through the various, complicated mechanisms that the state may use. That is not within our purview as advisory council members to change. And the law doesn't say anything about that, but there are existing mechanisms. But long story short, that funding can start to flow July 1st. It needs to be spent or encumbered up until the end of June next year. At which point there should be another tranche of green fee funding that will be released in FY28's budget. And presumably some of those groups that are funded in year one, or those initiatives that are funded in year one, can go back to that funding source and may have the chance to get continued funding. The way the act is written, you cannot propose, I think, unfortunately, multi-year projects, but that is has more to do with not recognition that the challenges require multiple years, but the way that our state budgeting process is currently constructed writ large. So I don't know, Jeff, if you wanted to add anything to that, or Carmel or Dennis.
I don't know if we're speaking out of turn here, but I think among the council and others, there was a desire to have a special fund for the green fee, and that would open up the possibility to do multi-year projects, which we recognize are so many of these things are long-term investments. Janice on our council used the analogy, are we planting kalo or planting koa? And for so much of this, we need to plant both. Projects that we can start today that might yield results many years down the road. So that might be a discussion at the legislature for changes to the legislation to really enable that.
Okay, that is a big, complex question and issue area. So thank you very much for all of the questions that came in around that theme and for the thoughtful responses of the advisory council. We really appreciate it. Okay, so some technical process questions now. We have a question here from what sounds like another potential project submitter who says, if anything's in a submitted project proposal is deemed unclear during the evaluation process, would the point person be contacted to elaborate, or are submissions final as they were submitted?
I can jump in on that one.
Yeah.
So I think I'll start. So I think considering our very condensed timeline, I think anyone who has kind of administered or done this process, it's usually at least 6 months. We're trying to do it in 2 months with a lot of integrity. And so the short answer is likely not. I think we're trying to get this list of priorities to the governor as soon as possible. And so we're taking kind of like the as much information as we could. And, in a very rare case, I think we would kind of reach out again. But I think I would say for myself, probably likely not in this round. But, I think this is the first year iteration of this process. And so I would imagine for subsequent years, there'll be kind of more back and forth in terms of funding determinations and questions.
Next, I have a clarification question. It seems like on something that I heard mentioned earlier as well about the what the recommendations are going to look like that go from the advisory council to the governor and then to the legislature. So the question is, how detailed will those recommendations be? Is it going to be inclusive of like the text that was submitted by people who are sending project ideas into the portal, or is it at a higher level than that or more general than that?
So there's two answers to that. So, and this is me learning in real time. So what we submit to Gov and what's going to be included in the budget, I think we made the joke and we all dated ourselves. Like it's less than a tweet, right? And this is what's get posted publicly in terms of like the supplemental budget request. And so we're submitting kind of like as strategically worded things as possible that can include as much descriptors. However, as a council, we're also developing in with the support of our wonderful team at Pa'akai Communications, like a more detailed and robust report. And so I would say probably likely not cutting and pasting verbatim from project ideas and submissions, but really like lending to the integrity of what was submitted, probably reflected more robustly in the final report.
Okay, Carmela, keep your mic open because I've got another one for you on evaluation. The questioner asks, you've identified a cost benefit analysis. Understanding cost is straightforward. How are you evaluating the benefit side of the formula?
Great question. So I think, not I think, what's wonderful about the 10 folks on the council is that there's such a diversity of expertise. And so based on that expertise, like that's what we're leaning on in terms of like what are the benefit. My understanding of the benefit of a resilience project, that's Dennis and Janice, right? And if it's a sustainable tourism project, like that's more, my lane. And so we're leaning on the expertise of the council and then kind of like our knowledge, and our networks to understand like what the benefit of a project would be. But Dennis, Jack, Jeff, feel free to weigh in too.
Yeah, I can answer that. So we're not asking the applicant to do a formal benefit cost analysis. It's fairly complicated and entailed, and but they do provide us enough information to get some idea of a benefit, like in terms of like hazard resilience. We have some ideas of what some types of benefits are, like like say a wind retrofit project, how much it would benefit, and then we also consider the cost. So if two projects, have roughly the same benefit, but one's $100,000 and one's $1 million, the first one's obviously going to have a higher benefit to cost ratio. Generally, for a FEMA project, it has to be at least above 1-to-1. Okay. A typical mitigation project is 6-to-1. There's some projects that are above 6-to-1. And there's some projects that FEMA has done a pre analysis of benefit cost that we could potentially go into. But we're not going into that much detail right now. We have to analyze these projects based on the information we're given. Yeah.
Oh, very good. Thank you. Anything else anyone wants to add on that? Okay, next question, because I know we're running short of time, so I'm just going to keep us moving and so we can get through as many as possible. Another process question, just for in the name of transparency and clarity, which is really important to all of us. Jeff, I'm going to ask you to start us off on this. The question is regarding the departmental proposals that were submitted. The question asks in advance of the public portal, but just I'll offer as a clarification that this was actually a process executed in parallel to the public portal. Was there a direct reach to the state agencies in advance of the public one? It looked like the initial summary did not include the University of Hawaii in the list of department submissions, and we're wondering if there was a solicitation to departments and whether UH was included.
Yeah, great question. A lot of this was really on the administration, casting the net. Many of the departments had their priorities ready to go from, previous iterations of this. We know that, budget and finance queried all of the departments and asked for their priorities and flagging which ones were clearly green fee aligned as opposed to simply general funding. It's unclear to me, and maybe some other council members understand it better, but that all departments were asked. We did receive some from University of Hawaii via the public portal. I don't believe we saw any in the departmental ask list. So yeah, that was very much sort of out of our hands. That was really the administration proffering here's our departmental priorities for your consideration. And we did the best we could with what we were handed.
So we have a handful of more than a handful. We have about 30 questions that we have not yet been able to address. And so I apologize to everybody who still has an outstanding question. And recognizing that we're coming to the 1:30 mark, just want to acknowledge again that we will make sure that all of these questions get addressed, either in our FAQ section of our website or with a direct email to you if that seems like it's going to be more appropriate using the contact information that you provided when you registered. I am happy to share, well, not actually happy, that's the wrong word, but that we got an answer to that cruise ship question. Our awesome team did some asking and permission getting during the course of this webinar to find out what that revenue figure is that a lot of you were curious about. It sounds like it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 30% of the green fee funds would be generated by the cruise ship revenue. So the answer to that is somewhere around 30% is the estimated projection there. So with that, I just want to thank everyone again for spending the time and for the really thoughtful questions and suggestions that we have gotten from you all, not just during this webinar, but really on an ongoing basis as the Green Fee Advisory Council has gone through this process. And, Jeff has pointed out a couple of times through the course of this this webinar today that it's really an effort for all of us to engage in. And we're so grateful for your engagement and for your passion around these issues. We'll see, if there are any closing words from our advisory council members, and then we'll wrap up.
I can say one thing. I know probably many people on the call are curious as to the mix of projects and that, and just trust us that we are working really hard. We are all volunteering in this. We come from a range of different sectors. It's an incredible amount of material. It's also a lot of material. We are under a hugely quick timeline to both solicit the ideas, which we did earlier, and then, even building our own evaluation criteria, evaluating all of them, looking at the price tags, trying to gather more information, understand the mechanisms that can be used by the state to flow this money out. Like many of the questions that are in here are things that we have come up in our conversations. Some of them were more clear on than others, and we've done our best to answer some of those today. So we are working hard to get those recommendations together, and just thank you to all of you from across the different communities for your engagement with this. Our doors are open, our ears are open, and we appreciate it.
I would echo that, Jack, and also say, gratitude is an understatement. I think reading through the 600 plus submissions. It is very apparent that one, we can't do this work without all of you, without community, because this is where kind of like that the collective effort happens. And so thank you to everyone who submitted projects and are so invested in this process alongside all of us. And so really grateful to all of that and to all of you.
Yeah, I'd like to thank everyone else for submitting projects. We're working hard to, make sure everything works as well as possible. We want to make sure the projects support each other and, are well coordinated and efficient. And we're going to try and do our best to, utilize everything that came in and make an impact for Hawaii.
And I'll just echo the gratitude and appreciation. Jack, Carmela, Dennis, the whole crew on the council, Christine and her team, the administration, and importantly, all of you for sharing those ideas, asking the tough questions. We're stronger together, and this is again really a generational, unprecedented opportunity for Hawaii to get resources where they're needed. So we're deeply grateful for the opportunity and for all of your input.
Well, thank you again for everyone's participation today. You'll hear from us again soon. If you haven't already, please sign up for the newsletter where we will be putting out regular updates, including the invitation to the next webinar. So mahalo nui. We'll see you all soon.
Aloha.
Bye.